It's Friday. That means another edition of the Zogby Report with my son and partner Jeremy, and I'm John. And this is real and unscripted and spontaneous. That's how we do it, and that's how we're going to do it. So let's jump right in, okay? So first of all, just a small bit of information we can talk about, some politics by way of an update. Then we've got a bigger question to deal with for the rest of the broadcast. So Ohio has a Republican Senate primary Tuesday, May 3rd. And it's been a wild and woolly one. There actually are 7 candidates. We're not going to mention 2 of them. They've been showing up at about 1%. But the main candidates have been J.D. Vance, who wrote the famous bestseller Hillbilly Elegy, Josh Mandel, who's a former state attorney general, Matt Dolan, Jane Timke, who was the Republican state chairman for a while, and Mike Gibbons, a businessman. For much of this race, the buzz has been about Gibbons and Mandel. They've been going at it, and in fact, may very well have neutralized each other. But they've been taking turns leading in the race. But 2 things have happened just in recent days. One is that J.D. Vance has carved out for himself a MAGA position, which is not to say that some of the other candidates, Mandel and Gibbons, haven't done the same. But President Trump came in and endorsed J.D. Vance just a few days ago, and we've seen Vance rising in the polls. In fact, in a few of them actually taking the lead. This is a clustered race among 3 or 4 of these candidates. On the other hand, the one candidate in the race who's been carving out for himself what you might call the anti-MAGA position, that's Matt Dolan, who seems to be running in the tradition of this seat. George Voinovich, Rob Portman, who is retiring, Mike DeWine, the current governor, John Kasich, taking on more of a moderate conservative image. And there's the new poll out this morning, this is Friday, with Matt Dolan leading by 1 point. In any event, what we have is a clustering, but I think we have anybody's race here. And when we say anybody's race, the stakes are very high, because Democrats are not having any infighting. While there technically is a primary, Tim Ryan, congressman, popular congressman, is leading handsomely, will more than likely win. They go in as a united party. Can the Republicans unite? Which direction will they go? A couple of these candidates swinging way over to the right. Other candidates like Dolan, more in the moderate position. We are polling Ohio as we speak. And so we expect to have fresh numbers maybe Saturday or Sunday. We'll see.
Easily.
Okay, so just a warning to stay tuned to folks to watch for our Ohio poll. Shortly thereafter, we're going to have some Florida numbers where we have really some intriguing races going on. Before we move into the big question and then your comments politically, we're following Georgia as well. We've reported on Georgia before, but by way of an update, obviously Herschel Walker, a very strong position to win the GOP primary for Senate, and running against the incumbent for a year or so, Raphael Warnock. Walker continues to lead that race by anywhere from 2 to 5 points, but we haven't seen Warnock jump ahead at all. And most recent polling still has Herschel Walker leading. What's really interesting is that Governor Kemp is in a primary against Purdue, and he's winning handsomely in the Republican primary. Purdue is endorsed by Donald Trump. But in the matchup between the Republican Kemp, Democrat Stacey Abrams, who now of national fame, barely lost the last gubernatorial election and has been devoting most of her time to voting rights in Georgia and nationally, still doesn't seem to be able to get beyond a 5-point deficit against Kemp, but it's still close. And so that's kind of a political update. Do you have any comments before we get to the big?
No, I think you covered everything.
Okay.
At least with those races.
With those races, okay. So here's the big question for the day, and it comes via our friend and colleague in Miami, Dexter. Thank you, Dexter. There's a shout out to you. Are we in World War III? That's how he put it, and I figure let's answer it. You want to go first?
Yeah.
Good, because I want to go second.
We are.
All right.
Already.
Really?
In World War III. There's no question about it. How much further it goes in terms of which type of fighting remains to be seen. But it is World War III. Why is it World War III? Because there's economic warfare.
Yes.
And economic warfare always leads to hot warfare. You'd mentioned before about, and I think I had too, about the embargo against Japan leading up to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And then by way, you've also mentioned that there are some scholars who think that FDR knew that he had the intel that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. I mean, there are historians who suggest that. There are historians who say he didn't. I don't think it matters. The fact of the matter is, when they embargoed Japan, the purpose was to get the Japanese to attack so that the United States could get into the war. So when they knew, the whole point of the embargo was to have conflict in the Pacific and have a pretext or a good enough justification, rationalization to enter the war. I see a parallel here. We know that for years, going back to 2014, the United States has been providing lethal aid, as the official term from the RAND Corporation paper I mentioned, titled Unbalancing and Overextending Russia, providing lethal aid to Ukraine. And the next level have been all kinds of sanctions throughout the years, but these recent sanctions have really declared war. And so it's, unless the only way to walk this back, which I don't think is possible, is for the United States to get out of Ukraine and to stop providing lethal aid and to say, you know what? We're going to keep NATO in, let's say, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. We won't expand into Sweden. We won't expand into Finland. And we won't expand into Ukraine. But they're already getting Finland into NATO. Finland's going to announce that any day now. So is Sweden. And all of this has been warned against by Russia. Do not do it. Do not over-encroach into our territory. From their vantage point, and I think it's correct, it is a declaration of war. It's been happening for many years. So we're there. The question is who's going to, how will the U.S. be drawn into a bigger conflict? Would that be by some cyber attack, by some foolish move? That's where we're at.
Okay, I'm not going to disagree. I'm just going to challenge.
Sure.
Though, I think first of all, I don't believe we're in World War III. I believe we could be in World War III, but I don't think we're there yet. And maybe in no special order, I'm going to try to be as logical rational about this as I can. Number one, I think it's really interesting that rather than use the 1930s, early 40s European situation as a model, that you went to Japan because that seems to be much more of a parallel of what's going on. Autocratic regime carving out for itself a sphere of influence. In that case, Japan in East Asia, and the fact that that was a major threat economically to the United States. Plus the stories of brutality against the Chinese and Koreans and Southeast Asians by Japan. Did Roosevelt manipulate the situation? He enabled the situation. And I think the best historical stories right now with any real evidence is that Roosevelt probably knew that there would be a Japanese attack somewhere. To take that extra step and say that he knew that it would be Pearl Harbor, that's a step too far. Unless somebody can come up with direct evidence, and I doubt they ever will after all these years. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it is we could liken this self to the period of the phony war in Europe, and that's in 1939 when Poland, that had alliances with France and England, Poland was invaded by the Soviet Union, and then for a good bit of time, France and Britain did nothing. That's why they call it the phony war. They mobilized, but they didn't attack. They aided Poland, but they didn't get boots on the ground. So we could very possibly be in that situation. The things that didn't exist back then that do exist now, on behalf of the argument for World War III, is the pervasiveness of media. Mm-hmm. And 24-hour media, and we're talking about the whole range. Television didn't exist, social media didn't exist, it does now, and it's brought to our living rooms. There's a lot of buzz, but these days there's buzz with video. Back in 1939 and 40, there wasn't video. So that kind of enables the argument that we're heading towards World War III. The other thing, however, that was missing then that we have now is that we have mitigating mechanisms. Okay, say what you like, but we have a United Nations. We do have an international forum. We do have mechanisms to isolate, to embarrass, to sanction, not just one country at a time, but en masse, to hurt, an aggressive power. It may appear to be weak to some, but it's, for whatever reasons, while Putin marches through the Russian-dominated portions of eastern Ukraine, he's not having an easy time of it. And we, meaning the allies or whatever, are managing to get material and humanitarian aid and so on over to Ukraine in record speed. So maybe hope springs eternal here. This could be World War III tomorrow, but I don't think we're in it now.
Yeah. Well, of course, the goal of Russia is to wrap this up as quickly as they can. Whether they'll be able to or not, I don't know, but one thing remains certain. The West, led by the United States, led by Washington, D.C., I should say, will continue to aid. And we need to be clear on what that aid is. It's heavy artillery. It's military aid.
Which the Ukrainians have requested.
It's been going in there for quite a while.
Yeah.
But thinking about it, this is an entirely new kind of war. Mm-hmm. It's like Fifth generation warfare. A lot of it is playing out in the media. Some could say the battlefield is really our minds, perception, narratives, and I've already covered the economic warfare aspect of it, and the proxy warfare, and it just really it creates a situation where one wrong thing, and there could be a really big mistake here. It's almost like Dr. Strangelove, the ending of that movie. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen, but you have to be careful.
All right, so this is a real curveball, but I'm throwing it to me, too, as well as you, so that neutralizes the unfairness. Scenarios. How do you suppose this will play out? You can give a positive scenario, a negative scenario, or whatever you want to do with it. It's an unfair question, because obviously, folks, we don't know.
Yeah.
So we're speculating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you go back and you look at the trend going to the First World War, when World War I was complete, you had the League of Nations. That was a failure. World War II, you had the birth of the United Nations, much more of a success in terms of getting people on board. You couple that, you put that aside, and then you look at the talk over the last couple of years about the Great Reset, and this notion from people at the World Economic Forum that there's an opportunity for a Great Reset, and actually Klaus Schwab himself said, speaking of COVID-19, that it was a rare window of opportunity for a Great Reset. That's how he described the pandemic. Here we are, and it almost feels like phase two. Phase one was the pandemic. This conflict is phase two. This is amidst all of this talk of the Great Reset. We saw the League of Nations at the end of World War I. We saw the United Nations. One can't help but think that this is steering towards some kind of world government. That the institutions we know right now, if this conflict rages on, will crumble, and from the rubble a phoenix would rise. It could be a monetary order. It could be a mixture of the UN and perhaps multinational corporations. I mean, who's in a better position in terms of technology to take something like the UN and bring it to a level that's enforceable? So that's how I would see it playing out if I had to answer and gamble on it.
Okay, so I don't think I'll live to see a world government, but you will. And how it's composed, and if it's truly transnational, just like money, just like work, just like so many other things are going, not simply transnational, just transgeographical, will remain to be seen. I think what happens in the short run is either that a deal is struck with Vladimir Putin, that he gets formally what he's had semi-formally now for about a decade, which is the Crimean and eastern region of Ukraine. That smacks of Sudetenland prior to World War II, but perhaps if that's enough to buy some peace and stop some killing, that could be enough. If that's the case, then the Baltic countries and Scandinavian countries have a lot to worry about, because traditionally Russia has wanted that protectorate zone. The key here is the power that we haven't talked about, and that's China. You know, if China has been neutral, so to speak, tilting towards Putin, offering, some mild criticisms against Putin, but keeping its options open. The biggest risk is that if there is this Sudetenland compromise, with Russia, then that's a ticket for China to invade Taiwan. That's where we get into World War III. Nobody wants that. A lot of people don't want that to happen, including the United States. That's a different story. I mean, Taiwan has a lot of people and a lot of friends. So with that said, I think the scenario is, on one hand, a world government, on the other hand, a brand new Cold War between autocracies that more and more people seem to want during these bad economic times. They want stability, versus democracies which are failing right now. Different kind of story than after World War II. It was autocracy versus democracy, but democracy was, was on the upswing. I could say a whole lot more, but this is a podcast. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Sudetenland analogy is interesting because, and I've said this, and I mean, I just feel free to criticize our government. I mean, I think that's our job, is that who are the ones invading all the nations? I mean, if you look at the last 20 years, you could say Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, but what was the lead up to that? Who gave the ticket to Saakashvili to go in and put down those breakaway regions? That was George W. Bush prompting a Russian response. You could say that Russia invaded Ukraine, but who meddled into the election and the Maidan revolution and provided arms, and so it's just interesting that actually, if you look at it objectively, NATO is more expansionist and more aggressive than Russia, and it almost is a wonder how it took this long to provoke or poke the Russian bear, especially on its own historic ties to a country like Ukraine. Same thing with Taiwan. How much interest do we have in Taiwan? How much interest do we have in Ukraine? Do we have so much interest in these countries that we potentially risk World War III? I mean, remember, World War I, 9 million people. These are official. It could be higher, could be lower. 9 million people gone in one continent. World War II, 60 million people. That's not even counting what Mao did to his own people following, and Stalin, and what Lenin did in the 20s. Now we're getting north of 100 million. What would World War III look like? I don't even think we could even fathom.
No.
So just to close on that
sure.
point, Taiwan and Ukraine, is it really worth it? And can we imagine a scenario where the Chinese or the Russians were coming into the Gulf, were coming into the Hudson Bay and saying, actually, we have right to these waters too, or we have a right to have a naval base near the Bahamas? I mean, we would freak out. And so here the United States gets to dictate to China what they get to do in the South Chinese Sea. It's interesting. It's very problematic. I think it requires some serious thought.
I've got a lot that I could say. Obviously, this is going to be an ongoing discussion of ours. Suffice it to say, just for now, it's a very, very shaky situation, and I think in particular what you talk about in terms of casualties, we're not talking about boots on the ground. We're talking about shutting down electrical grids.
Yeah.
We're talking about stopping dams from performing. We're talking about banks, massive destruction, lack of access to capital, lots of poverty, questions about who controls, no stability. Those are really frightening prospects, not distant battlefields at all. But in any event, hopefully we're not there yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
So on this happy note, we end, and we'll pick up. We'll have some politics to talk about next week, probably. And
More and more.
And incidentally, just like our friend Dexter, if you've got an idea for what we should talk about, write in the comments section, or write directly to Jeremy or to me. Love to hear your thoughts, your comments, and maybe select one of the topics that you recommend.
Have a good week.
You too.